Welcome to Anatomy of the Extraordinary, the podcast that unveils true, remarkable stories from the edges of human experience. I'm your host, and today we dive into another extraordinary journey.
You know, usually when we look back into history, we're dealing with dust.
Right, dust and crumbling parchment.
Exactly. Faded sepia photographs, maybe some rusted metal or, fragmented pottery.
Things that feel very far away.
Right. It always requires a pretty significant leap of imagination to see the actual breathing humanity in those artifacts.
Yeah, you really have to squint to see the people.
But then, and this is what we're looking at today, you step onto the frozen, desolate shores of Beechey Island, way up in the high Canadian Arctic.
Utterly isolated.
You dig down into the permafrost, and suddenly, history isn't dusty at all. It isn't abstract. It is staring right back at you, literally staring.
The eyes of John Torrington.
The eyes of John Torrington.
It's an image you do not forget.
No, you don't. For those who aren't familiar with this image, I want you to picture a 20-year-old Victorian stoker.
A young kid, really.
Yeah. He was buried in 1846. And when anthropologists finally opened his wooden coffin in the 1980s, after 138 years entombed in a block of solid ice, the permafrost had maintained literally everything.
It's unsettling how well preserved he is.
His pale skin, his half-open pale blue eyes, the linen burial shroud tied neatly around his chin to keep his jaw closed.
Yeah.
It's just this haunting, visceral image. He looks like he could just sit up, clear his throat, and start speaking to us.
He really does. And Torrington's eyes aren't just looking at us, they're asking a question.
Right.
They're asking how the most advanced, arrogant, wildly funded expedition in human history ended up as a frozen graveyard.
Because he is just one of the 129 men of the legendary Franklin expedition who vanished into the ice without a single trace.
It is the absolute definition of a frozen time capsule.
Yeah.
But one that contains an unparalleled multi-layered tragedy.
Yeah.
And the really chilling thing about Torrington is he was one of the lucky ones.
Yeah, which is crazy to think about.
He died early, and he was buried with dignity. The fate of the 126 men who outlived him is something straight out of a psychological horror film.
And unpacking that horror and the centuries of obsession that led up to it is our mission for this deep dive.
It's a massive story.
It really is. We were exploring the 400-year, obsessive, and almost unfathomably lethal quest to navigate the Northwest Passage.
We have a huge stack of source material to guide you through this today.
We do. We've got archaeological reports, historical logs, modern forensic data from literally as recently as 2024.
Brand new stuff.
And geopolitical analysis of the Arctic today. We are going to look at the ultimate story of human hubris, the raw biological realities of starvation, and the modern race against climate change to save the shipwrecks of the doomed Franklin expedition.
Before they wash away entirely.
Exactly.
To even begin to grasp the scale of this, we have to put you, the listener, in the environment. We need to lay out the geographical reality of the Northwest Passage.
Because it's not what people think it is.
No, it is not just a river. It's not a simple clear-cut strait. It is a 5,780-kilometer labyrinth.
It's a maze of ice.
Shifting ice, jagged underwater shoals, and thousands of barren islands connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans across the very top of Canada.
It is an environment that is actively, aggressively hostile to human biology.
Actively trying to kill you.
Which sets up this bizarre central paradox that we're going to explore today.
Yeah.
How on earth did the absolute most technologically advanced expedition of its era, what was basically the Apollo moon mission of the 19th century, become the greatest tragedy in naval history?
Well, a guy in a tiny retrofitted fishing boat managed to succeed where the mighty British Empire failed. Just a few decades later.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can understand why 129 men died screaming in the ice, we have to figure out why Europe was so utterly desperate to sail through it in the first place.
Right, because nobody wakes up and decides to sail into a freezing labyrinth just for fun.
No, they certainly do not. This wasn't driven by scientific curiosity.
Or the romance of exploration. Not at all.
Right. So what was the driving force?
It was driven by brutal, cold-blooded economic necessity.
Money.
Always money. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to go all the way back to the year 1453.
The fall of Constantinople.
Exactly. The Ottoman Empire suddenly takes control of the region, which means they effectively monopolize and choke off the traditional overland trade routes.
The Silk Road.
Right. Suddenly, Europe is completely cut off from the unimaginable wealth of Asia. The silks, the spices, the porcelain.
But wait, why not just build ships and sail south? Around Africa or South America, why go north into the ice?
Because the southern oceans were completely locked down by rival superpowers.
Spain and Portugal.
Yeah. They had basically carved up the globe. Through a series of papal decrees and treaties, like the Treaty of Tordesillas, they militarized and controlled the sea routes.
So the routes around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa.
And Cape Horn at the bottom of South America.
So if you're England or France, and you try to sail south to get to India or China, you aren't just battling the weather.
No, you are running straight into heavily armed Spanish and Portuguese galleons.
You're going to get blown right out of the water.
Exactly that. They needed a shortcut, a northern corridor that would drastically cut the travel time to the spice markets of Asia.
Entirely out of reach of Iberian warships.
A theoretical Northwest Passage.
Theoretical being the key word there.
Very theoretical.
Yeah.
The problem was, this passage existed purely in their imaginations and on highly optimistic, entirely fabricated maps.
They were just drawing water where they wanted water to be.
They had no idea what they were actually sailing into.
So began an era of basically throwing wooden ships at a giant wall of ice to see what would stick.
And mostly, what stuck was tragedy.
I was reading through the early attempts in our sources, and the sheer delusion is staggering. You look at John Cabot in 1497.
Oh, Cabot.
The man sails out on a tiny ship called the Matthew with just 18 guys. He genuinely believes he's going to hit the spice markets of Mecca.
Right?
And he ends up slamming into the coast of Newfoundland instead.
Right.
Not a lot of silk and nutmeg in 15th century Newfoundland.
No, just a lot of cod. And the escalation of these failures only gets darker.
Like Martin Frobisher.
Yeah, take Frobisher in the 1570s. He sails into the Canadian Arctic, utterly fails to find a passage to Asia, but decides he needs to bring something back to his investors.
You got to show a return on investment.
Right. So he ends up kidnapping local Inuit people to parade around London. And he fills his ship's hold with massive amounts of black ore, absolutely convinced he has discovered gold.
Let me guess. It wasn't gold.
It was iron pyrite,
Oh.
fool's gold.
Wow.
It was entirely worthless. They ended up using it to pave roads in England.
That is embarrassing. But the darkest of these early chapters has to be Henry Hudson in 1610.
Absolutely.
Hudson pushes deep into the massive body of water that now bears his name, Hudson Bay.
Yeah, he mistakenly thinks he has bypassed the continent and reached the Pacific Ocean.
He spends months trying to find an exit south, and as a result, his ship gets locked in the extreme winter pack ice.
Which is a death sentence.
I want to pause and put the listener in that situation. Imagine you are a 17th century sailor. You're wearing wool that is probably soaked through.
Freezing.
You are trapped in a wooden ship that is groaning and cracking under the pressure of the ice. The sun barely rises. You have no fresh food.
You're getting scurvy.
You're thousands of miles from home, and your captain refuses to admit he made a mistake. What happens when spring finally comes?
The crew breaks. They are starving, their bodies are ravaged by disease, and they are completely disillusioned with Hudson's leadership.
So they mutiny.
They do. They drag Hudson, his young teenage son, and 7 crew members who remain loyal or were too sick to work.
And they throw them into a tiny open rowboat.
They set them adrift in the maze of pack ice, turn the main ship around, and sail back to England. Hudson and his son were never seen again.
That is deeply chilling. It's an entire century of voyage after voyage, ending in mutiny, starvation, kidnapping, or just total financial ruin.
Complete disaster.
Which forces the question, who in their right mind keeps paying for this?
It wasn't cheap.
Ships were incredibly expensive. If every expedition ends with dead sailors and a cargo hold full of useless rocks, how does this keep happening?
That is where the history of the Northwest Passage intersects with the invention of modern corporate finance.
Okay.
To fund this literal meat grinder of human lives, the British had to invent a completely new economic engine.
Right.
In 1551, Sebastian Cabot, Richard Chancellor, and Sir Hugh Willoughby founded something called the Muscovy Company.
And the sources highlight this as a massive turning point. Why was the Muscovy Company so revolutionary?
Because it is widely considered the world's first state-recognized joint stock company.
Meaning what, exactly, for the average investor?
Well, before 1551, a wealthy merchant or an aristocrat might personally fund a single ship. He buys the ship, pays the crew, buys the provisions.
And if that ship hits an iceberg and sinks...
That single merchant is financially ruined. He goes bankrupt. The risk was absolute. The joint stock model decoupled that massive financial risk from a single individual.
I see.
They distributed the cost across hundreds of investors, all of whom held tradable shares.
Hang on, so this is essentially 16th century Silicon Valley venture capital.
Exactly.
You are inventing a financial structure entirely designed to absorb massive, frequent, catastrophic failures.
Right. You know that 9 out of 10 ships might sink.
But you're banking on that one unicorn success. If one ship makes it through and brings back a hold full of spices, or, in the case of the Muscovy Company, establishes highly lucrative trade relations with Russia, the payouts are astronomical.
And dividends could be upwards of 40%.
Wow.
It was a brilliantly robust economic engine. But consider the moral hazard it created.
Because it completely detached the wealthy investors sitting in warm London coffee houses from the human cost of the exploration.
Exactly. If a ship goes down and 40 men freeze to death in the dark, the investor doesn't face ruin.
They just lose a fraction of their portfolio.
The financial pain was diluted, which meant they could relentlessly, callously feed ships and men into the Arctic for decades.
It's the privatization of exploration, underwritten by human collateral.
It really is.
But even with unlimited venture capital, the physical reality of the Arctic ice eventually proved too much.
It did. By the early 1600s, after explorers like William Baffin concluded that there simply was no navigable path through the ice-choked waters of Baffin Bay, the economic interest evaporated.
The investors gave up.
They realized that even if passage existed, it was too choked with ice to be commercially viable for trade ships. The Arctic was deemed a frozen dead end.
So the obsession went dormant.
Dormant. For a very long time.
Until the 19th century. Fast forward to 1845. The world has changed completely. The British Empire is now at the absolute peak of its global power.
The Napoleonic Wars are over.
Right. So the Royal Navy finds itself in an awkward position. They have a massive technologically advanced fleet and a bunch of highly ambitious, battle-tested officers sitting around London drawing half pay with absolutely nothing to do.
Idle hands and infinite resources.
The British Admiralty looks at the map of the world. They've mapped almost everything. But there is this glaring blank spot at the top of Canada.
About 70,000 square miles left to chart.
They decide it is time for the ultimate brute force mission to map the final stretch of the Northwest Passage. Not for trade this time.
No, for pure imperial glory and scientific dominance.
I want to focus on the man driving this renewed obsession. Sir John Barrow.
Barrow.
He was the second Secretary of the Admiralty. He was 82 years old, sitting behind a desk in London, and he was completely obsessed with what has to be one of the most dangerously flawed scientific theories in history.
The open polar sea.
Yes. It is a fascinating piece of pseudoscience.
Barrow genuinely believed that the sea around the North Pole was entirely free of ice.
Wait, stop. I need to push back on this. They thought the North Pole, the absolute coldest northernmost point on the planet, was a warm, open ocean.
Yes, they did.
How is that logically possible when everything hundreds of miles south of it is frozen solid? How did they rationalize that?
It sounds absurd to us, but they had a complex theoretical framework for it. They believed that seawater, because of its salinity, simply could not freeze if it was deep enough and constantly moving.
Okay, but it's still below freezing.
They also theorized that warm equatorial currents, like the Gulf Stream, flowed deep under the ocean's surface and welled up at the North Pole, creating a balmy, temperate oasis at the top of the world.
So what about the ice they kept hitting in Canada?
They thought that was just a seasonal, localized ring of ice clinging to the landmasses.
So their foundational assumption was that the ice wasn't a permanent geographic feature.
Right.
It was just a temporary barrier, an annoying wall. And if you could just punch through that outer wall of ice, you'd be sailing in clear, open water all the way to Asia.
That arrogant assumption doomed the expedition before it even left port. They viewed the Arctic as an obstacle to be battered into submission by British iron and scheme, rather than an ecosystem they needed to understand and adapt to.
Which brings us to the man they picked to lead this battering ram, Sir John Franklin.
Yes.
And reading the sources, what struck me is that Franklin wasn't this energetic, visionary explorer in his prime. He was 59 years old.
He was notoriously overweight, too.
And he wasn't even their first, second, or third choice to lead the expedition.
No, Barrow was quite reluctant to tap Franklin. He originally asked 3 other famous polar explorers.
And what did they say?
They all basically looked at the planet and said, "No thanks, I'd rather live."
Sensible guys.
Others were deemed too young, too inexperienced, or simply too argumentative to take orders from the Admiralty.
So they settle on Franklin.
Franklin, who had survived previous brutal overland Arctic expeditions, one where his men actually had to eat the leather of their own boots to survive, was well-liked, deeply religious, and desperate for one last chance at glory. So he gets the job.
But what Franklin might have lacked in youthful vigor, the Royal Navy absolutely made up for in sheer, overwhelming technological might.
Oh, the technology was unparalleled.
Let's talk about the ships. The HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, these were not fragile wooden merchant vessels.
No, they were ex-bomb vessels.
Explain what that means for people who don't know naval architecture.
Bomb vessels were warships originally designed to carry incredibly heavy, massive mortars used to bombard coastal forts.
Okay.
Because they had to withstand the massive recoil of these mortars, their hulls were built phenomenally strong.
Like floating tanks.
Exactly. For the Arctic, the Navy took these already sturdy ships and reinforced their bows with dense layers of oak and heavy iron plating. The idea was to literally use the ships as kinetic weapons to smash through the pack ice.
And it wasn't just wind power. This is the Victorian era, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
They were the first Arctic ships to be fitted with auxiliary steam power. They literally went to the London and Croydon Railway, bought 2 massive steam locomotive engines, ripped off the wheels, and shoved them deep into the wooden hulls of these ships.
It was an engineering marvel. But putting a steam engine in a wooden sailing ship meant you needed propellers.
And a standard propeller would be instantly sheared off by the jagged ice.
So they designed an ingenious system of iron wells that allowed the crew to physically winch the screw propellers and the ship's heavy rudders directly up into the hull whenever the ice closed in.
That's actually brilliant.
It was. They even installed a patented Sylvester hot water heating system. It was a network of iron pipes that pumped warmth from the boilers throughout the lower decks to keep the men comfortable in the freezing temperatures.
It sounds unsinkable. It sounds perfectly designed.
It does.
But as history constantly reminds us, whenever someone builds a ship and calls it unsinkable, it is usually a prelude to catastrophic disaster.
Every time.
Let's look at the fatal flaws hidden beneath all that high-tech Victorian engineering, starting with the food.
The provisions.
To survive in the Arctic, they needed a 3-year supply of food for 129 men. How do you preserve that much food in 1845?
You use the relatively new industrial miracle of canned goods.
Right.
The Navy put out a massive order for 8,000 enormous tins of meat, soup, and vegetables. They awarded the contract to a provisioner named Stephen Goldner.
But there is a massive logistical failure here.
A huge one.
Yeah.
They gave Goldner just 7 weeks' notice to produce 8,000 custom-made tins.
7 weeks? That is a recipe for cut corners.
Absolutely. The canning process required workers to solder the seams of the tin cans shut by hand using a mixture of tin and lead. Because Goldner's factory was so rushed, the soldering was horribly sloppy. When modern forensic anthropologists eventually found some of these discarded cans strewn across the Arctic ice more than a century later, they discovered thick bands of toxic lead solder dripping like melted candle wax directly into the interior of the tins.
Meaning that the crew's primary foundational food source was slowly marinating in heavy metals for months before they even opened it.
Exactly.
But it wasn't just the food. The lead poisoning had an even more insidious delivery mechanism.
The water system.
I want to talk about those massive steam locomotive engines. They required a ton of fresh water every single hour just to generate steam. You can't use salt water in a boiler, it'll corrode and destroy it. But they are sailing in the ocean. How do they get the fresh water?
They installed a unique, newly invented desalination system.
Yeah.
It was designed to capture the steam from the boilers, condense it, and turn seawater into fresh water. And because it produced a surplus, it is highly probable that this system also provided the daily drinking water for the crew.
Okay, but if you boil and condense water, it's purified, right? How does that hurt them?
The water itself was purified of salt. But we have to look at the mechanical chemistry of this system. Modern researchers, particularly a historian named William Battersby, analyzed the schematics of this desalination plant.
And what did he find?
Given the materials used in the 1840s, this complex system relied heavily on lead pipes and lead soldering. When you pump hot distilled water, which is actually highly corrosive to metals, through lead pipes, it aggressively leaches the heavy metals.
Oh my God.
The crew was likely drinking highly concentrated toxic lead every single day.
That is utterly terrifying. You're saying their entire life support system, their food and their water, was quietly poisoning their neurological systems from day one.
From the moment they set sail.
And you combine that invisible biological threat with what they actively chose to bring on board. And the sheer cultural arrogance is mind-blowing.
It really is.
Let's look at the cargo manifest. They brought a massive 1,000-book library. They brought a pet monkey named Jocko.
A monkey? In the Arctic.
They had scented soaps, silk handkerchiefs, mahogany writing desks, and sterling silver cutlery engraved with their individual family crests.
Because they fully expected to maintain the exact same standard of upper-class London living while trapped in the ice.
Right. But do you know what they didn't bring? They brought absolutely zero specialized equipment for traveling over the ice. They brought no sled dogs.
Nothing.
And most crucially, they had zero training or knowledge of how to hunt the local wildlife in the Arctic. It was an expedition built on the assumption that they could just pack up a comfortable slice of Victorian England, bolt an iron engine to it, and force it through a frozen wasteland.
It's the ultimate manifestation of imperialism, the belief that nature bends to British engineering, not the other way around.
So with all this baggage, technological, toxic, and cultural, they set sail. In July 1845, a commercial whaling ship spots the Erebus and Terror moored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay.
Waiting for a break in the pack ice so they can enter the labyrinth.
The men are up on the deck, waving to the whalers, totally optimistic. That fleeting moment in Baffin Bay is the very last time European eyes ever saw them alive.
The transition from that cheerful, optimistic departure to the terrifying reality of the ice trap is chilling.
It's a steep drop-off.
Based on the few scattered records and graves we eventually recovered, we know they spent a relatively successful first winter moored at Beechey Island. That is where our young stoker, John Torrington, died of pneumonia and was buried in the permafrost.
Right.
But the fatal, irreversible mistake, the true beginning of the end, happened the following summer, in September of 1846.
They sailed down the west side of King William Island.
They did. And to understand why that was a death sentence, you have to understand the mechanics of Arctic sea ice.
Lay it out for us.
There is seasonal ice, which freezes in the winter and melts in the summer. And then there is multi-year pack ice. Ocean currents in the Arctic continuously push massive, dense, multi-year pack ice down the McClintock Channel.
Like a conveyor belt.
Exactly. It acts like a geographic funnel, driving millions of tons of hardened ice directly into the western coast of King William Island. It is essentially a plowing train of ice that never ever thaws. It just compacts year after year.
And if they had just sailed down the eastern coast of the island?
The eastern coast is sheltered from that current. The ice there melts enough in the summer to allow a ship to pass. Had they gone east, they might have actually survived.
But Franklin went west.
He sailed his iron-plated ships directly into a vice. The temperatures dropped, the multi-year ice closed around the Erebus and Terror, and they were beset. Locked and solid.
They were stuck there for 19 solid months.
Almost 2 years.
Imagine the psychological toll of that. Put yourself in the lower decks. The sun disappears entirely for months at a time during the Arctic winter. You are living in perpetual darkness, lit only by foul-smelling whale oil lamps.
And the noise.
Yes. The physical pressure of the ice is constantly groaning, screeching, and popping against the wooden hull. It sounds like the ship is being crushed in a giant nutcracker. You never know if tonight is the night the hull gives way and the freezing water rushes in.
Constant terror.
And while you are dealing with this psychological terror, your body is starting to fail. The men are getting sick.
Very sick. The physiological horrors were compounding in a way that is hard to overstate. First, you have the poorly preserved tinned food. The sloppy soldering didn't just leach lead. It allowed bacteria to enter.
So they're getting food poisoning.
Men were contracting botulism and severe food poisoning. Then, because they had no fresh meat and their lemon juice rations were losing potency, scurvy set in.
Scurvy is one of those words that sounds almost cartoonish to us now, like something out of a pirate movie. But the biological reality of scurvy is a nightmare. Can you explain what is actually happening to the body?
Scurvy is a profound deficiency of vitamin C.
Where?
Your body uses vitamin C to synthesize collagen. Collagen is essentially the biological glue that holds your cells, your tissues, and your blood vessels together.
Okay.
When you stop getting vitamin C, that glue dissolves. Your body literally begins to unknit itself. Your gums swell and rot, and your teeth fall out. Blood vessels rupture under the skin, causing massive black bruises.
That's horrifying.
But the most horrifying aspect is that old scar tissue relies on collagen to hold together. If you had a deep cut or a broken bone when you're 10 years old, without vitamin C, that old wound will spontaneously reopen. A healed bone will detach.
Your body's literally falling apart while you were still alive.
And diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia were running rampant through the damp, crowded, poorly ventilated lower decks.
Yes, and overlaying all of this immense physical suffering was the severe lead poisoning from the water and the food.
It's the silent killer.
Lead attacks the neurological system. It causes profound paranoia, extreme physical weakness, crippling abdominal pain, and total cognitive collapse.
You have 129 men who are starving, freezing, bleeding out from scurvy, and slowly losing their minds to heavy metal toxicity.
And the absolute only firsthand account we have of this descent into hell is a single crinkled piece of paper.
Just one.
It was discovered years later by a search party, tucked inside a metal cylinder and hidden under a pile of stones on King William Island. It's known as the Victory Point Note.
Such a tragic document.
And what makes this piece of paper so incredibly haunting is that it contains two entirely different realities written at two different times on the exact same page.
It is a profound historical document. The main body of the text was written in May of 1847. It's cheerful, standard naval procedure.
Business as usual.
He gives their exact GPS equivalent coordinates, mentions that they wintered at Beechy Island, and ends with the remarkably confident words, Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition. All well.
All well. That was May 1847. But if you look at the margins of that exact same paper barely 11 months later, in April 1848, a new, frantic message is scribbled around the edges.
Written by Captain James Fitzjames and Captain Francis Crozier.
And the tone is completely, utterly shattered. It says that Sir John Franklin died in June 1847. It says a staggering total of 9 officers and 15 men are dead. That is a massive mortality rate for a supposedly well-provisioned ship.
Huge.
The ships have been completely abandoned to the ice, and it states that the remaining 105 starving, poisoned men are going to step off the ships and attempt to walk 400 kilometers south across the jagged sea ice to reach a remote trading post on the Canadian mainland.
It was a death march. They were naval men, they were sailors, not overland Arctic explorers.
Right.
They were already dying of scurvy, their limbs swollen and bleeding, and their minds were deteriorating from the lead poisoning. And yet, in a bizarre, almost hallucinatory testament to their failing cognitive state, they decided to load massive, heavy wooden lifeboats onto iron sledges and drag them by hand across the jagged pressure ridges of the sea ice.
And what did they put in those heavy lifeboats? If you are making a desperate run for your life across a frozen wasteland, you pack survival gear, right? High-calorie food, ammunition, heavy blankets.
You would think so.
No. When search parties eventually found these abandoned boats years later, they were filled with heavy, completely useless dead weight. Books, stacks of boots, silk handkerchiefs, scented soaps, hair combs.
Is madness.
They even found a copy of the melodramatic Victorian novel The Vicar of Wakefield. They were literally dragging their Victorian gentility, their drawing room comforts, across the ice while they were starving to death.
Shows a total inability to adapt. Their minds were failing, yes, but their cultural programming was so strong that they couldn't conceive of leaving their status symbols behind, even as those very symbols exhausted their last remaining calories.
Which brings up a fascinating and difficult turning point in the aftermath of this disaster. For decades back in England, while search parties were looking for them, the British public, the press, and the Admiralty absolutely refused to believe that their elite naval heroes died in anything but a noble, glorious, and highly civilized manner.
They painted pictures of Franklin reading his Bible to the men as they peacefully froze to death, saluting the Union Jack.
But the ice doesn't care about Victorian propaganda. The ice preserved the horrific, visceral truth. And the first person to uncover that truth and bring it back to London was a Scottish explorer named John Rae in 1854.
Rae was different from the naval officers.
Very different.
He traveled light, and he did something genuinely revolutionary for a European at the time.
Yeah.
He actually sat down and listened to the local Inuit people.
He treated them as reliable witnesses, which they absolutely were.
Precisely. Through interpreters, Rae interviewed Inuit hunters who recounted chilling stories. They spoke of seeing a group of 35 to 40 starving white men walking south, looking thin and sick, literally falling dead in the snow as they walked.
Distraughting.
But the most shocking detail, the detail that caused an absolute explosive uproar in London high society, was the Inuit testimony regarding the final encampments. They told Ray that they found boots filled with cooked human flesh.
Survival cannibalism.
The British officers had resorted to survival cannibalism.
The backlash from the British elite was immediate, vicious, and entirely predictable. They couldn't handle it. The idea that their Christian gentlemen would succumb to something so primal was an affront to the entire imperial narrative.
Oh, they attacked him relentlessly.
Even Charles Dickens, the beloved author of A Christmas Carol, wrote scathing, wildly racist articles publicly attacking the Inuit as babbling savages. Dickens fiercely defended the moral purity of the Royal Navy, insisting that British officers, by their very nature and breeding, would never, ever resort to such a barbaric thing.
He suggested the Inuit themselves must have murdered the crew.
It was a massive cover-up, driven by racism and classism, but the truth was patiently waiting in the permafrost, long after Charles Dickens was dead. Fast forward to the 1980s and 90s, when modern forensics finally caught up to the oral history. A forensic anthropologist named Owen Beatty launched a project to find the truth.
Beatty's work was groundbreaking.
His team went to Beechey Island, exhumed the bodies of Torrington and 2 others, and tested their hair and bone samples. The lead levels were astronomical.
Tell them the numbers.
They measured 226 parts per million of lead. To give you context, a normal Inuit skeleton from the exact same era and region has about 26 to 36 parts per million.
The men were saturated in poison.
And then, in 1992, the true horror of the Inuit accounts was validated. Archaeologists found skeletal remains of the crew near a bleak, rocky area called Erebus Bay on King William Island.
And when they put those bones under a microscope,
they found physical, undeniable blade cut marks on the femurs and the skulls. They also found evidence of pot polishing,
which is horrific to think about.
It's a distinct smoothing that happens when the shattered ends of bones are heated in boiling water as they violently rub against the inside of a metal cooking pot. They weren't just eating the flesh, they were cracking the bones open and boiling them to extract the marrow. The Inuit accounts were 100% accurate.
It forces us, as modern observers, to confront the absolute, total collapse of their social structure.
Here's where it gets really interesting. For a very long time, historians and naval apologists assumed that, okay, if cannibalism happened, it was the lower decks.
Right, the stokers.
It was the uneducated stokers and the common sailors who lost their minds and started eating each other in a desperate frenzy. The officers surely maintained their dignity.
But let's fast forward to the year 2024.
A team led by archaeologist Douglas Stenton is using cutting-edge DNA testing on a mandible, a human jawbone, that was found with those exact horrific, desperate cut marks. They extract the DNA, they track down a living descendant in the UK, and they find a positive match.
Yes. That butchered, cannibalized jawbone belonged to Captain James Fitzjames himself.
The commander?
He was the commander of the HMS Erebus. He was the man who co-wrote the frantic final margin notes on the Victory Point document.
I need that to sink in for a second. A high-ranking, deeply respected, decorated British officer, eaten by his own men.
Think about the sociological implications of that. In the polite drawing rooms and exclusive gentlemen's clubs of Victorian London, rank and status were absolutely everything. A captain was practically a god to his crew.
Untouchable.
But out on the ice, slowly freezing and starving in the pitch black, rank meant absolutely nothing. The primal, visceral biological drive to survive completely overwhelmed centuries of societal inhibitions and deeply ingrained class structures. The crew consumed their own captain.
And the ultimate tragic irony of this entire horrific ordeal, it didn't save them.
No.
It only prolonged their suffering by a few agonizing days. Not a single man out of the 129 survived.
It is so incredibly bleak. It feels almost deterministic, like they were doomed the second they left Baffin Bay.
It really makes you wonder, was the Northwest Passage just a cursed strip of water? Was it fundamentally impossible for humans to navigate it? Well, no, because just a few decades later, someone actually does it.
Enter Roald Amundsen.
Ah, Amundsen.
He was a Norwegian explorer who studied the Franklin disaster obsessively. He looked at the tragedy and he asked himself a critical, analytical question. How do you succeed where the greatest, most heavily funded naval power on Earth failed so catastrophically?
And what was his answer?
His answer was brilliant in its simplicity. You do the exact opposite.
I love Amundsen's story. It is the perfect antidote to the bloated arrogance of the British Navy. It starts like something out of a heist movie. It's 1903. Amundsen is completely broke. He is deeply in debt, and his creditors are literally threatening to seize his boat the next morning.
So what does he do?
In the dead of night, in the pouring rain, He and his tiny crew sneak down to the docks. They quietly board the boat, cut the mooring lines, and slip out of Oslo harbor under the cover of darkness, literally on the run from the repo men.
And the ship he was fleeing in the Gea could not have been more different from Franklin's Leviathans. Let's compare them.
Let's do it.
The Erebus was a massive 378-ton iron-reinforced warship designed to bombard forts. The Gidiva was a tiny 47-ton converted wooden herring boat. It had a pathetic little 13-horsepower engine and a crew of only 6 men.
6 men, compared to the 129 men Franklin brought.
Amundsen deliberately chose to sail small. He understood a fundamental truth of extreme environments. A massive crew requires massive resources. The Arctic ecosystem simply cannot support 129 men marching across it.
But 6 men could survive.
6 men, however, could survive. Furthermore, and this is crucial for the navigation, the Gijai had a very shallow draft.
For those who aren't sailors, the draft is basically how deep the bottom of the boat reaches underwater. A heavy warship with a deep draft acts like an underwater plow, hitting every hidden rock and ice shelf.
Exactly. Amundsen's boat essentially skimmed over the water. It allowed him to navigate through the deadly underwater shoals and narrow, shallow straits that would have instantly trapped or gutted a larger, heavier British warship.
But the biggest difference wasn't the mechanics of the ship, it was the attitude of the captain. Franklin tried to bring Victorian England into the Arctic, dragging mahogany desks and silver spoons over the ice.
Amundsen arrived with humility.
He decided to let the Arctic teach him how to live. When he got to King William Island, he didn't barricade himself inside his ship. He parked the boat in a sheltered inlet he named Gora Haven, and he spent 2 entire years living alongside the local Netsilik Inuit people.
What's fascinating here is the stark contrast between imperial arrogance and anthropological openness. Amundsen became an eager, observant student.
He really did.
He realized very quickly that the heavy, tight-fitting wool uniforms of the European navies were totally useless in the Arctic. Wool traps sweat against the body, and in sub-zero temperatures, that sweat freezes into a layer of ice against your skin. It kills you.
So what did he wear?
Amundsen traded with the Netsilik for traditional reindeer skin and caribou clothing. The indigenous clothing is incredibly warm, but because the animal hairs are hollow and the garments are worn loosely, it allows moisture to escape.
He learned how to build snow igloos instead of freezing in drafty canvas tents. He learned how to use sled dogs efficiently, and crucially, he learned to hunt.
He adopted the local diet of fresh seal meat, caribou, and seal blubber.
And because fresh raw meat naturally contains enough vitamin C to synthesize collagen, his crew was completely protected from scurvy. No toxic lead-soldered cans from Stephen Goldner required.
And while he was doing this, while he was thriving, not just surviving, he was conducting rigorous, groundbreaking science. He and his crew spent months trekking overland, using indigenous techniques to pinpoint the exact location of the shifting North Magnetic Pole. He proved conclusively that the magnetic pole actively moves over time rather than remaining static.
Finally, in August 1905, the ice clears just enough for the Jiu to slip through the extremely shallow waters of the Simpson Strait. This is the exact narrow route that Franklin had fatally missed when he steered into the multi-year ice.
On August 26th, after weeks of navigating through fog and ice, the lookout spots a sail on the horizon.
It's a commercial whaling ship out of San Francisco. They had done it. They had crossed the passage. Amundsen wrote in his diary that when he saw that ship, a strange feeling welled up in his throat, and he broke down in tears on the deck. His boyhood dream was realized.
He had proven, definitively, that the Arctic was not an enemy to be battered by iron and steam, but an environment to which one must listen and adapt.
Okay, so Amundsen solves the passage. He escapes the repo man and becomes a global hero. But there is a massive loose end here.
The wrecks.
The physical graves of the Franklin expedition, the massive hulking wrecks of the Erebus and Terror remain totally hidden beneath the ice. They were lost for over 160 years. How is it possible that 2 massive warships just vanished?
They remained lost because, for over a century, European and Canadian searchers were looking in the wrong places. And they were looking in the wrong places because they continued to ignore or discount the incredibly precise, multi-generational oral histories of the Inuit people.
Still ignoring them, even then.
The Inuit had stories of exactly where a large ship had sunk and where another had been crushed. It wasn't until modern archaeologists from Parks Canada began working closely with local Inuit historians, like the late Louis Kamukak, that they started searching exactly where the indigenous stories told them to look. And surprise, surprise, they found them.
They found the Erebus in 2014 and the Terror in 2016. And I have to say, reading the accounts of the modern environment these archaeologists are working in is completely insane. This isn't a sunny scuba diving trip in the Bahamas looking for pirate doubloons.
Far from it. This is extreme underwater archaeology. They're operating in water that hovers right at the freezing point, about 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. The ocean is only free of surface ice for a few short weeks in late August and September before it freezes solid again.
The divers wear highly specialized, thick suits that are constantly heated by warm water pumped down through an umbilical cord from the surface vessel just to keep them from going into hypothermic shock.
Even with that, their dives are strictly limited to a maximum of 2 hours.
It's basically a spacewalk underwater. They have a hyperbaric recompression chamber sitting right there on the dive barge in case someone gets the bends. But my absolute favorite, terrifying detail from the Parks Canada reports, they literally have crew members standing on the deck of the barge with loaded .30-06 rifles and shotguns, constantly scanning the horizon.
Because you are diving in the middle of active polar bear hunting territory.
A 1,000-pound apex predator could just swim up and climb onto the dive barge looking for lunch.
It is incredibly perilous work. Yet despite these extreme conditions, what they are pulling up from the seafloor is breathtaking.
Oh, the artifacts are amazing.
Because the Terror sank in deeper water and was sheltered in a bay, it was largely protected from the crushing weight of the moving sea ice. It is virtually a pristine time capsule. The ship's wooden wheel is still standing perfectly upright. There are fragile glass panes still intact in the captain's stern windows.
And from the Erebus, which sits much shallower at just about 36 feet of water, they've hauled up incredible artifacts. They brought up the ship's bronze bell, they found a lieutenant's epaulets, and they found intensely personal items that really bring the humanity back into focus.
Like what?
They found a hairbrush with actual human hairs still attached to the bristles. They found Captain Fitzjames's artificial horizon tool. But the craziest, most puzzling find is a mysterious, heavy seaman's chest they hauled up from the lower decks.
Yes. When they opened that single wooden chest in the lab, archaeologists discovered an arsenal. It contained over 20 sidearms, mostly pistols.
Now stop and think about that. Why on earth are 20 pistols stashed in one guy's footlocker? That is not standard naval storage. Was it a desperate, impromptu armory gathered by the surviving officers to defend themselves against an impending mutiny as the lower deck started going mad from starvation and lead poisoning?
It's a very real possibility.
Or, and this is equally fascinating, was it a stockpile gathered by Inuit salvagers who boarded the abandoned ghost ship years later, pooling the strange metal weapons together before the ship finally slipped beneath the ice?
It is a tantalizing mystery. It speaks to either the total breakdown of order among the crew or the intersection of two cultures on an abandoned ship.
Yeah.
But the tragedy of modern archaeology is that we might not have time to fully solve it.
Why is that?
And this brings us to a deeply cruel global irony. The very reason modern searchers were finally able to get boats into these waters and locate these ships is because human-caused climate change has drastically reduced the extent of the summer sea ice in the Arctic.
The ice is melting.
But now that the protective layer of thick ice is gone, the Erebus, sitting in just 36 feet of water, is entirely exposed to the violence of the open ocean. Without the ice acting as a lid, increased storm waves and powerful sea swells are literally ripping the wooden wreck apart.
Parks Canada is engaged in a desperate, frenzied race against time to excavate the ship and pull the history out of the water before the warming ocean completely destroys it.
It forces us to zoom out from the wrecks on the seafloor and look at the surface of the Northwest Passage today. The route that slaughtered explorers for 400 years, the ice that crushed the British Empire's arrogance, is currently undergoing a radical, irreversible transformation.
With the ice melting, the fever dream of those 15th century spice merchants in London is actually becoming a reality. The Northwest Passage is opening.
It cuts the commercial shipping route from Rotterdam to Tokyo from 21,100 kilometers down to roughly 15,900 kilometers.
That is a massive shortcut that saves shipping companies millions of dollars in fuel and time. We are now seeing massive commercial freighters, like the Nordic Orion, hauling coal and cargo straight through these waters.
And perhaps most surreal of all is the arrival of massive luxury cruise ships. Think about this. In 2016, the Crystal Serenity, a $350 million 13-deck luxury Leviathan, carried 1,100 tourists through the exact same passage where Franklin's men starved, bled out from scurvy, and resorted to cannibalizing their own captain.
It is so wildly dystopian. People are standing on the deck in parkas, sipping martinis and taking selfies, gliding over the exact spots where desperate men dragged wooden lifeboats until their hearts literally gave out. It's wild. But this sudden accessibility is sparking a massive modern geopolitical conflict.
Naturally. Because when a new trade route opens, nations vie for control. Canada currently claims the waters of the Northwest Passage as its internal sovereign waters. They argue it is Canadian territory.
Makes sense.
They are increasing military patrols, they are building deepwater naval facilities, and they are essentially asserting that they have the right to control, regulate, and potentially tax who gets to pass through their archipelago.
But the United States, along with the European Union, China, and several other maritime powers, absolutely refuse to accept that claim. They insist the passage is an international strait. They argue it should be open to free transit for anyone, completely free of Canadian regulation, environmental oversight, or tolls.
It is a profound geopolitical standoff. A maritime route that was utterly economically useless and deadly for 4 centuries is suddenly rapidly becoming one of the most critical and heavily contested shipping lanes on Earth. The melting ice isn't just revealing old shipwrecks, it is fundamentally shifting the balance of global maritime power.
So what does this all mean? Let's take a step back and look at the incredible arc we've covered in this deep dive.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We started with the deadly, high-stakes corporate gambles of the Muscovy Company in the 1500s, turning human lives into venture capital. We watched the ultimate hubris of the Victorian Empire shatter against the immovable multi-year ice, leaving the poisoned, cannibalized crew of the Erebus scattered across the rocks of King William Island.
We saw how the humble, brilliant adaptability of a guy in a tiny fishing boat, Roald Amundsen, finally solved the puzzle by actually listening to the indigenous people who understood the land.
And now we have modern archaeologists in heated suits dodging polar bears to pull history out of the freezing water before global warming washes it away completely.
It is a profound, sprawling testament to the limits of human ambition, the danger of cultural arrogance, and the relentless, unforgiving power of the natural world.
Which leaves us with a lingering thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. For centuries, the Arctic ice was an impenetrable vault. It crushed our arrogance, it froze our massive iron ships, and it kept our darkest, most horrific secrets perfectly preserved in the permafrost, just like John Torrington's staring eyes.
A vault.
But as human-caused climate change permanently thaws that vault, turning a frozen graveyard into a bustling commercial shipping lane for container ships and cruise liners, we have to ask, what other hidden historical truths are waiting down there to wash ashore?
And as nations rush headlong to exploit this newly opened frontier, fighting over sovereignty and trade routes.
Are we destined to just repeat the exact same hubris of the Victorian explorers, sailing blindly into a changing environment we don't fully understand?
Thank you for joining us on this adventure. Until next time, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it and keep seeking the extraordinary.